Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michael Scott of Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and this is the first of a series of Zooms on China and the West cultural dialogues. It's a series of events in an overall Georgetown University initiative, the Future of the Humanities Project, which is run in partnership with Campion Hall and with Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford in the UK. We hope the project will bring people together through the promotion of the arts and humanities. The aims of this particular series, which are run in cooperation with SACU, which is the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding in London, is to explore the history, culture, and traditions of China and to look for comparisons in Western society. Through them, we hope that we will be able to increase our knowledge of the rich cultures of both East and West. Today, our audience is composed of students from the USA, UK, and Chinese, British, and American scholars, and also members of the general public. Our speakers today are Chinese, English, and US nationals. But the thing that unites us is a desire to develop an understanding of our respective cultures and peoples. China is obviously a huge country. We can only take a snapshot and we will be generalizing, so most people will be giving us insights from their own personal perspectives. However, we hope our audience can add to those insights and would like to ask questions. And you can do this by using the QA button at the bottom of your screen. And we encourage you to start to ask those questions, typing them in from the start. About half an hour before the end, I'll be handing over to my colleague, Barnaby Powell, and he will be putting questions, as many questions as he can, to the panel. In future, we hope to discuss a range of topics, including philosophy, literature, music, and theatre. Also, we plan to hold further panels with leading US, UK, and Chinese scholars, artists, and entrepreneurs. But for today, I'd like to briefly start by just introducing our panel. Professor Kerry Brown is from King's College London, and he's an internationally renowned scholar on Chinese studies, having written about 20 books on the subject. His latest book, China, explores historical developments from about 1949 to the present day. Professor Michael Wood is an English historian and broadcaster. He has recently written a book called The Story of China, which accompanied the successful TV series of the same name. His documentary on Du Fu, one of China's greatest poets of the 8th century, has received praise from China and the UK. Professor Catherine Temple is head of the Department of English in Georgetown and is an integral member of the Future of the Humanities Project. She's been involved with a China Forum, which was a collaboration between Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica, which brings Chinese academics and public figures together with international partners to discuss common challenges at the intersection of culture, ethics, and global society. And Tong Ping is from Chengdu and now works in the UK. She's a specialist in international education, having extensive experience in higher education, both in China and in the UK. Now, I'd like to start really by going to Kerry and saying, and I'm going to ask the same question to each of our panelists just to get us going. And I wonder, Kerry, what sparked your interest in China? Later, I'll ask Tong Ping what sparked hers in the West. But Kerry, what sparked yours in China?
Really complete accident. I've often thought about this. When I was growing up, China was not that visible. The People's Republic of China was still in the period of Mao Zedong. And my first memory, I think, of being aware of this place was, I guess, the day when his death was announced in September 1976, when I saw this elderly Chinese gentleman's face on TV. And of course, that great iconic image of him that you kind of see, it's still, I think, in Tiananmen Square now, kind of the elderly Mao. But then I kind of really fell into it after I worked in Japan for a year, became really interested in Japanese kanji, the characters, most of which had been taken from China. And so it's purely accidental, but that was 30 years ago, and it's been a long and happy accident. I just wanted to, just one other thing. I have been looking a lot at the history of Europe and China over the last 500 years. And one of the things that's really striking me is, of course, at the moment, Europe and China are having a tough time, like the US and China, and having lots of arguments. And it seems that there's always this sort of idea that we're just kind of encountering this new place. China always has a sort of slight element of surprise and newness about it. But the thing that I've been really amazed by, despite 30 years now of dealing with China in one way or another, is how deep and long the relationship was between China and Europe, right to the, kind of 17th, 16th, 17th century, to the Enlightenment, Leibniz, Voltaire, Montesquieu, really key figures, Hegel, Max Weber, Bertrand Russell, these are key European intellectual figures who thought a lot about China and what the difference between China and Europe or Britain, if they happened to be there, was. And one of the kind of more interesting ideas, I suppose, is how Chinese encounters shaped European identity. We think of it often the other way around, that Europe kind of shaped maybe China, particularly in modern times. But actually in the Enlightenment, I think it was that figures like Leibniz particularly, who had such a profound influence on political philosophy and the development, and Montesquieu in Europe, were really profoundly impressed and informed by particularly the Jesuits and their testimony of China. And that kind of made us who we are. So in encountering China now, in a strange way, we're sort of encountering ourselves coming back to us. And I think that's kind of often maybe forgotten or not even really known about the relationship between particularly Europe and China, and maybe by derivation, the United States and Canada and China too. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kerry, because I think that's a nice introduction also to Michael. Michael, how did you get involved, and would you agree on that as well?
Yeah, I think in the 18th century, the philosophes and all the great European intellectuals of the Enlightenment looked at China as the great civilization. The higher standard of living, a higher standard of achievement in almost every field. And the early Jesuit missionaries as well, like Matteo Ricci. Ricci talks about the rule of the philosophers having been achieved in China, and contrasted the violence of European history and the European desire to dominate as being, that was something to be seriously contemplated. For me personally, actually, it was started at school in a volume of Penguin poets, the poets of the late Tang. And you open a book like that and you realize that you're a teenager and you suddenly, this is a world that you never dreamed existed. Incredible riches, and the Chinese poetic tradition is older than the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Book of Songs is older than the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you open something like that and you never look back. I first went to China in the early 80s, and I can't wait to go back again somehow. It's not just books, it's the people themselves who are so hospitable and sociable, and Yeah,
great. How about you, Catherine? What's your experience in terms of getting an enthusiasm for it?
It's quite a personal thing for me because we adopted a daughter from China in 1996. And now I have a lovely daughter in her early 20s who's prepping for med school and lives down the hall from me. So it's just, she brought me to it, but I became fascinated with some of the connections through my study of the Enlightenment as well. Right. And then many trips to China over the years have just been amazing. So that is kind of the story. So it wasn't originally an intellectual interest, and then it became very much so an intellectual interest. And Kerry, I just have to say, Kerry, I love this idea that when we're looking at China in some way, we've been so influenced that we're actually looking at ourselves in some ways. Right.
Yeah, great point. Tong Ping. You unmute yourself. And why did you get interested in the West, Tong Ping?
Like Kerry, I would say I come to the West by accident or fate. I was working at a Chinese University for Minorities, and I worked with a lot of Western universities. At that time, we had a very close working relationship with the University of Manchester for Chevening Scholarship. And we sent quite a lot of minority students to further their study here. I also planned to do a master's degree in Tibetan Buddhism and their promotion in the West. And after learned my plan, the vice chancellor of the Manchester University offered me a scholarship to do a master's degree here. So I came, and then later I was invited by Mike to go to North Wales to help their international office. So I enjoyed my work there because over the years we have worked with so many universities worldwide and recruited so many international students to the UK, including a lot of Chinese students. I enjoy seeing those students benefited so much from their study in the West. So here I am.
Thanks, Ping. That's terrific. I want to go back to Kerry now, because in your work, Kerry, you talk about the hybridity of Chinese culture and the difference of values between Western and Eastern traditions. And I just wondered whether you could briefly outline what you mean by this and why it's important for the West to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of what do Chinese believe has always been a, kind of a sort of difficult one. First of all, what do we mean by Chinese and the kind of stability of that idea? Because as Tong Ping has just sort of referred to, I mean, in that term, there are many different kinds of identities. And geographically, as Michael will know from the work he's done, China's not been the same thing. There's been many Chinas over, the last 2.5 to 3,000 millennia and longer. And so, kind of what do these people believe may be a very, very strange question, but it's always sort of haunted, I think, Europeans particularly. I mean, you've got to believe something, haven't you? To be someone, you've got to believe something. And I think the historian F.W. Mote, in a great book he wrote, Imperial Chinese History, wrote of this idea that in East Asia, I mean, he used the term East Asia, there was a resistance to the idea of truth with a capital T. It was that you could live in a syncretic world where Buddhism, Taoism, kind of Confucianism, and then more recently, kind of Marxism, Leninism, communism, capitalism, and of course, Xi Jinping thought are all kind of, belief systems. And there's no need to kind of, you can live between these worlds. There are imperial figures who happily practiced Buddhism, but also were Confucianists. I suppose Qianlong, Kangxi, these emperors, Yongzheng, managed to live in different worlds. And I suppose that sort of helps understand why today, it's this very kind of big anomaly, isn't it? Kind of a country that, well, it says it's communist and yet it looks pretty capitalist. And actually, if you have that sort of tradition of not always wanting to have this kind of universal idea of a truth, well, you can do that. I suppose finally, the great kind of issue now, I guess, is the sort of value system, I suppose, of Europeans and North Americans, the West, if you want to call it that broadly, I know that includes many other places, is that there's got to be, like a neat kind of theory, a neat pattern for the world. You've got to, there is this thing, truth, with a capital T. And I mean, I think that probably is true. Yes, there is this thing called truth. But also there's enormous complexity over how you construct that. And I suppose China sort of contests this, the way that it has a view of the world which is able to hold in tension in that intellectual tradition I've just sort of very broadly outlined. Very different views of the world. I mean, to me, I guess as Europeans, we can accept that as a pluralistic view, but it's certainly the cause of big political issues at the moment. And I only heard today that the Americans are going to be holding a big congress on democracy at the end of the year, to which China will not be invited. I mean, that seems symptomatic, this idea that, there's these big ideas that you have to embrace, otherwise you're simply wrong. And I suppose China kind of contests that.
Michael, is this your experience as well? I mean, you're used to having to take real kind of complex historical spans and get them into structures, both for your broadcasts, which You know, as I've said before, I've watched your broadcasts almost all my adult life now, but also then turning them into books. Do you find that this compartmentalization is there in the way that Kerry is talking about? Need to unmask. Unmask. You
I
need
think,
to.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think no, I'd agree with Kerry on that. I mean, I spent many years in India, and you have this feeling about you know, the idea that there is one truth is really alien to the culture, and I think it's alien to the cultures of East Asia. And I wonder whether monotheism is the great the great error in this. One hesitates to say it to kind of British and American TV audiences, you know, that monotheism contains within itself all kinds of givens about the nature of society and the nature of history, you know. So, but yes, I would. I mean, the only thing I'd add about democracy is that it's a very interesting question, this, isn't it? And I think it's very sad that the Chinese are not going to be invited to that big seminar on democracy, because even though the Chinese are an imperial system and monarchy, as Liu Zehua says in his many articles, you know, monarchism is the big thing in Chinese imperial culture, and we're still suffering from it. If that's the right word, we're still experiencing it today. It had a new incarnation under Mao, and we're having it again. Nevertheless, democratic ideas that you know, there's a deep-seated idea of democracy in ordinary Chinese political culture, and the relationship between the wise advisors and thinkers and the philosophers in the Chinese culture to the people, and the idea that the rulers have an obligation to the people is very deeply rooted in China, I would say, although I say this as a non-specialist, you know. It's much more complicated than one ever might suspect.
Catherine, you're nodding there. Do you want to come in?
Well, I'm just thinking about the complexity of this adoption experience and the kind of very oversimplified myths that tend to accompany it in the US. And that once you begin peeling those away and really looking at it as much as someone like I can, given that I don't speak Chinese, but during travel and taking my daughter back and locating her birth family, and then looking at the policies, the original history behind the policies, is very complex. And the reaction to it across China in different cities that we've been to, which are all the way from Beijing to Kunming, has been, you know, talk about hybridity, they're very diverse. So I'm just fascinated to think about the way, like, one personal experience, which is rather limited, is as we're speaking, I'm mapping it onto these more evolved historical and theoretical perspectives. So thank you for that.
Well, Catherine, if you stay unmuted for a while, you had a China forum, or were involved in a China forum that was talking about the humanities, and I understand it was talking about the kind of the rise of humanities in China at the moment, whereas in the UK, and I think a little bit in the US as well, there's a bit of a decline in the emphasis on the humanities. Have you got anything to say from that forum that you picked up?
Well, first, I do have to address the idea that there's a decline. There's kind of an attack on the humanities, but in some ways it's actually making the humanities a bit more prominent in public discourse than it has been. Yeah, the forum was fascinating, particularly in the work of Wang Hu that we discussed. He's written this amazing very historicized, very detailed article about the history of the humanities in China and its current state. And I think the non-Chinese on that panel were very interested in how complex the Chinese educational system is in regard to the humanities, and how many different sort of categories things were divided into, and the, you know, great commitment that the universities had to the humanities. What I've become really interested in is the sort of, I don't know, problem or concept of the public humanities in the US and the way it does or does not map onto other cultures. So something I'd love to discuss in this forum is the idea of the public humanities even translatable in China. It seems to me from my experience there that it's that the idea of humanities is so interwoven into the culture and into people's lives that the need for public humanities isn't necessarily seen. But I don't know enough about it, so I would love to hear more about it. There's two concepts here. One is engaged humanities, where universities reach out to the non-academic public, right? And the other one is public humanities, which in the US is largely funded by the government and involves sort of traditional projects like theater in the park and things like that. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Well, that neatly leads me to Ping, because I know you have an interest in education, Ping. Where do you see the humanities in China and the Chinese universities?
I think humanities are quite different ideas in Chinese universities and Western universities. And in China, we more likely to follow what is the government line in terms of humanity, and it changes from time to time. So like, even 20 years ago or 10 years ago or now, it's totally different about the idea of humanities. And now we focus on Xi Jinping's thought and to build up a grand China. So everything about humanities is around that.
How about Michael? I know you're working on Du Fu, a great Chinese poet of the 8th century. How did you get into that? And I'll come back to Tom Ping, see if Du Fu's on the curriculum these days. But in China, how did you get to Du Fu?
These are long stories, aren't they? And actually, Du Fu was led in the wonderful book of poetry that I bought when I was a teenager. I as a graduate at Oxford, I shared with a German sinologist, and wonderful people would come through your kitchen, like David Hawkes, who'd been in Tiananmen Square in October '49 and had translated The Dream of the Red Chamber and wrote a lovely little handbook to Du Fu. So it was a sort of long relationship, really. And we did a sequence on Du Fu in the Story of China series that we did for PBS and the BBC. And afterwards, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to try and do something, even though it had not been done before on Western telly, something that was accessible and conveyed this figure who, Stephen Owen, who we interviewed at Harvard, was saying, look, there's Shakespeare, there's Dante, and there's Du Fu. But how many people out there know this, and also that translation can get over some of the greatness of, a poet like Du Fu. So I thought it was worth trying for on public television, and that's what we did. The experience of doing it was really interesting because you realize you go to the Du Fu sites in China. There's quite a few of them. They're not the biggest literary pilgrimage sites. Lu Xun in Shaoxing, for example, you can't move a mile away from his house some days because the crowds are so great, because it's so important in the school curriculum. But Du Fu you also study at school, one or two of the poems, and you go to the Chengdu thatched cottage at Du Fu, and it's packed with people, and lovely people come from all over China sometimes, retired people. 3 sisters had come all the way from Shandong, and somebody else had come from Nanjing just on a rainy day. And they're all passionate about the poetry, and they all love the poetry, and they know the poetry. And one old boy, retired, living in Chengdu, said, I come here at least once a month just to think about Du Fu and read some of his poems. And so I think these things are quite alive in China. As people were saying about the humanities, they are alive in China, and the poets are still important to Chinese people. And you can, even in the era of Xi Jinping, you can quote a poet from the 8th century talking about the corruptions of government, and everybody knows exactly what you mean. That they're a very literate a historically literate population and sophisticated readers of stuff. So the public response was great, and it was shown on China terrestrial TV as well. You had online responses, newspapers, even the party's Central Commission for Discipline, which is the body in the Communist Party body that supervises the anti-corruption campaign, did an editorial about it, lamenting the fact that their Communist Party cadres have not internalized the loyalty that Du Fu had to the state. So they're still active in a way that a film about literature never would be in Britain.
Have you found this, Kerry, in terms of the literature in your work?
No, I mean, I think Michael's right. I mean, David Hawke's great translation, the first 3 volumes of The Story of the Stone, the Hong Lo Meng, I sometimes translated as The Dream of the Red Mansions, it really kind of made the most sort of significant, kind of literary work in Chinese since the 18th century available in English to an audience. It's not an easy book because the narrative structure is still very different. But I mean, it's, kind of great that it's accessible. I mean, you sort of come back to a little thing you said earlier about, how I got into interest in China. I mean, I have to say, and here's a bit of a mea culpa, that sinologists are definitely not the people that, help. I remember, I read in the 1980s, a novel by Elias Canetti called Auto da Fe, which is, kind of very famous novel. And it's the kind of great main character in that is a sinologist who is this terrifying figure who is sort of every day, working on some minuscule issue of Tang Dynasty sort of poetics grammar. And, that fixed in my mind that sinologists were the most terrifying, intimidating, awful human beings that you could come across. And when I sort of started to meet people who dealt with China, it was always, I thought I was going to meet one of, this sort of main character. I think he's called Peter. I remember the name of this guy in Auto da Fe, but they were all very, very human. I mean, very ironically, David Hawkes, as Michael would know, was a very approachable person, right? And I mean, and to sort of cap it all, I remember at the end of the 1990s, I was working for about 7 years. I worked in the British Foreign Office, and we held an annual lunar, kind of New Year party, one of our grand halls to, I think it was Lacana rooms in King Charles Street. And, we'd invite, everyone along that we felt significant. And there was this sort of very pleasant elderly guy that I got sort of stuck with one year. I looked after him and we kind of were walking around, and he made some hilarious comments about, what on earth the taxpayers were doing, putting all this together and, all the rest of it. Anyway, I found out his name was Glenn Dubridge, and he was the professor of Chinese at Cambridge and at Oxford. And I mean, we had a great time. He was extremely amusing. I mentioned him to a colleague who'd done Chinese later at Oxford, and they just went pale with horror and terror and said, my God, this guy is absolutely terrifying. He is, he's regarded, with complete terror because he was so demanding and, sort of exacting. And I have to say, I didn't get that impression from him at all, and I'd never been given an examination by him in Chinese. I'm sure if I had, I would not have had such a pleasant time that evening. So sinologists, maybe they look nice, but maybe if you scratch the surface, they can be still a bit prickly. But actually, I think my experience is that we got better, we got more friendly, we've got more user-friendly, definitely.
Well, I'm no sinologist either. I'm professor of English, and same as Catherine. And we revolted against in the perhaps the 1980s, 1990s about what we call the canon of English literature. Those people that you had to necessarily read. Do you think, Michael, that there's some kind of canon within the literature of China?
I'm not the person to answer that, really. Maybe Catherine might. I mean, obviously there is, and there's a classical canon, and there's a vernacular canon that kind of emerged in the 18th century, really. But maybe somebody else would like to speak about that.
Yeah. Tong Ping, have you got any views on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in literature, But I'm sure that what Michael knows about Du Fu is more than most Chinese. Yes, we have studied about his poems when we were in schools, but that was very limited.
Okay, Catherine, what's your view about this?
Well, based on my limited reading of the essay on the history of humanities in China, I think there probably is a pretty powerful canon that Confucius thought, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, a lot depends on how many people are actually being exposed to that canon, right? But in the U.S., the destruction of the canon was really a very prominent political movement in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, because the canon was completely composed of white males, right? So that in my period in the 18th century, the only author we were really allowed to read for our PhD exams was Jane Austen, other than white males. And that's just not the case anymore. It's completely fragmented and very, very different. If you look at any course now in English literature, you're going to see a wide variety of texts. So I doubt very much that has occurred in China. I don't know.
Yeah, Michael, you talked about the translation of Du Fu. What do you see as the benefits and the problems in relation to translating texts into or from Chinese?
Well, Kerry's the person to answer that. But what I would say is that, I mean, I was talking recently to Nicolas Chapuis about this, who's the EU ambassador to Beijing, but who's also a sinologist. And he's translating the complete Du Fu at the moment in many volumes. And it's a really wonderful piece of work, very engaging. And Nicolas is a really great believer in translation. And when we, after all, the point of this session that we're doing is about cross-cultural dialogue, and Chapuis is a great believer that translation can achieve this to a really useful degree, which of course it has to, because most of us can't speak or read Chinese. But then most people, English speakers in the world, probably are not fluent in Italian or German or French and read in translation. So I think. And there's a huge amount of translation being done from Chinese at the moment. So I think that's one path forward, to be honest, is acquainting people with what there is. And going back to the canon, I mean, obviously you've got the ancient canon, the Confucian classics and all that sort of stuff. And you've got the vernacular works that I call them, that arose in the Middle Ages, 18th century. But there's always time to revise and opinions on this kind of stuff. And China's literature is so rich, it's so prodigiously fecund, and the works are so great, so many areas that there's always room for looking again at interesting writers. When I was doing the book, I went out of my way to look at interesting female poets who'd not really been mainstreamed, not just famous ones like Li Qingdao, but Fang Weiyi and Zheng Yunduan, and some of the 18th century writers and 17th century novelists and the feminists in the 19th century. And the precursors are always there if you look for them. And I think in modern China, there's a really wide readership for rediscovering forgotten figures in Chinese history that have not been mainstreamed. The philosopher, the Enlightenment philosopher in China, who most kind of looked at all this, Zhang Suicheng, wrote biographies of women, interestingly enough, and commented quite a lot on this. And you can see that even in the late 18th century, they realized that the canon needed to be rethought. And he was the guy who famously said that the whole canon is history. Let's not raise them to the level of something that they're not. They are, everything is analyzable as a historical source, the whole of our earlier literary canon. And in the 19th century, and again, I should ask Kerry really, because I'm only an amateur in these things, but these different movements, leading to the new culture movement in the 20th, they started to open up all this, and there's no end to the possibilities.
I think this might tap onto this idea of the no truth with a capital T, right? Because the canon was held to be so almost sacred in literary studies until the 80s here, and maybe that was not the case in China, and that allows a lot of space for new texts and different texts without the same kinds of battles that we've had here. And I just wonder what Kerry thinks of that.
All roads point to you, Kerry, at the moment.
Well, thank you. I mean, there was certainly, because of Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, there was a series of canonical texts, a dogma was promoted through those texts and a set of practices. And you could argue that sort of continues to this day, with Mao Zedong and his selected works, and then Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, and now you've got Xi Jinping's sort of 3 volumes. I mean, there's the idea that you produce these definitive works and they have an authority, which is not just political too. And in terms of literature, I mean, Michael just referred to Lu Xun, I mean, that's also like a canon, every kind of, I'm sure Ping would be able to put me right here, but, everyone at the Chinese school would need to know about those texts. And I suppose a lot of the sort of, the diverse literature that Michael's just referred to, you would have to dig around. I don't know what universities in China are like in sort of, contesting the kind of more definitive texts or the more authoritative texts. I mean, just looking the other way, though, I can't think of any example the same as the amount of material from particularly Western languages translated into Chinese. This must be the greatest migration of language, materials in one language to another that's ever been done. Because you go into Chinese, like Xinhua bookstores, you will find the most extraordinarily obscure works translated into Chinese. I'll give you 2 examples. 20 years ago in Beijing, I remember attending the launch of a multi-volume translation into Chinese of all the works of Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein has, as far as I know, not yet been rendered completely into English. So this professor at Peking University had translated every single thing that Wittgenstein had ever written into Chinese, including material from the original German that hadn't been rendered into English yet. This was hilarious. So the only language at that time where Wittgenstein's full works were available was Chinese. And then the second is in the mid-1990s, so this is not a new thing, in the mid-1990s when I was living in Huahaltu in Inner Mongolia, I went to the Xinhua bookshop and they had a series of translations of the key works of every Nobel Prize for Literature winner from the beginning until then, 1994, 1995. Now, if you think of some of the amazingly obscure figures that have won that prize in the past and in recent times too, that was an extraordinary thing to translate from Russian, from, kind of English, German, French, lots of languages into Chinese. And I think that is an incredible testimony to the amount of kind of the sucking in of ideas in particularly contemporary China. Foucault, kind of Derrida, all of these translated. Finnegan's Wake translated into Chinese. 2 translations of Ulysses. I mean, good luck with that, right? I mean, Finnegan's Wake, translating that into Chinese, and yet it's been done. I mean, this is incredible, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Harold Pinter there, all the pauses. How do you translate Pinter's pauses? Yeah. Barnaby wants to come in.
Kerry, I don't think we understand Wittgenstein in English, let alone Chinese. I think you've probably partially answered this question that's just come in. I'll read it. Much as the Chinese are keen to promote the notion of an influence on the West in the 18th century, the evidence is notoriously suspect. Do panelists dissent from that skepticism And if so, why?
I mean, I think it was clearly complicated. So, you know, there was a process of information about China coming back to Europe and having quite an interesting impact on very key figures like Leibniz and Montesquieu and Voltaire and others. And I mean, whether, so this would be a great kind of thing to do. Did that make them think in a significantly different way about the situation politically and intellectually that they were in Europe? I mean, there's evidence that it did have an impact, but you would have to kind of look at it comparatively. I mean, Leibniz wrote 3 significant texts on China, and Voltaire wrote, I mean, a couple in the Philosophical Dictionary, and also, you know, his History of the World. I mean, they're kind of very discrete parts of their overall work. Did they fundamentally change their worldview, and did that have a wider kind of political and social significance? That's a hell of a claim. I mean, I think it's a claim that should be examined, but I seriously don't think at the moment the historians have probably looked at it in the depth where you'd need to kind of to answer that very important question properly. But I mean, Michael will correct me on all of this.
Please, Michael.
Unmute Michael, please.
Yeah, I was going to ask Catherine what she thought from her perspective on that, given that these are kind of cultural and influences, aren't they?
Yes, and I mean, you see all kinds of mentions of China in all kinds of texts from low to high, canonical and non-canonical. I have had a very hard time finding evidence that British authors were actually reading any Chinese authors in translation. So the information is somehow some information is being conveyed. A lot of information is hearsay and repeated from a very few sources.
Yeah, I mean, I get the impression that you're getting a lot of information in the, you know, Diderot and the philosophe and people like that. Writers in Britain are getting a lot of information from travelers, and some of the travel accounts are very, very interesting because, of course, in that period of especially the 18th century, travelers were witnessing a state that really worked, and you know, even the charitable organizations of the state and the provision for the poor and the provision for orphans and, you know, one-parent families and everything, that it was an immense, well-functioning state that really impressed them. I don't think they, and they saw the rule of the philosophers. I don't think they translated many things at that stage. I think there is a manuscript translation of Lao Tzu, is it, in the British Library, which I remember, you know, it was suggested William Blake might, through his contacts, have encountered at some point. You know, these were intriguing little moments, but you know, who knows? But I think that the big picture is that in the 18th century, people were very impressed by China. They understood that it was a different body politic from the way things were going in the West, although of course there were still great monarchies in the West, but they were very, very impressed by China. And in the 19th century, a transition goes over Western views of China, where they start to view it as, you know, you remember the famous Macartney quote when the British embassy went in 1793, and Macartney wrote it up afterwards saying, the state of China is like a crazy old man of war, a great ship that has been kept afloat by a succession of able commanders, but in the end is going to run on the rocks. It can't be rebuilt from the keel up, or something like that. And that change in opinion, how much did that reflect reality, or how much did it reflect the way the imperialists were changing their attitude to the world? I don't know what, Kerry's the one who studied all this, aren't you?
Kerry?
Yeah, I mean, so when historians talk about the Great Divergence, you know, why did, you know, economically Europe and China in particular sort of, you know, start to differ so much in the early 19th century? I mean, I think you're right. There's this sort of, this introduction of a kind of disdainful tone from the end of the 18th century. I mean, the Macartney, delegation was a sort of important point, but there was a Dutch delegation recently, kind of a very good account of that has been given from 1795, which was far less prickly and, kind of was much more sort of, kind of equable. But if you get into the 19th century, suddenly you have, I mean, John Barrow's kind of account of the Macartney exhibition is definitely the sort of the canonical text of, this, declining, decrepit, centralized, political system under Qianlong, and because he was writing an account of the Macartney delegation, and it's very disdainful, very, very disdainful. And that kind of doesn't really shift. I mean, hilariously, I kind of tracked down, I've always had it in the back of my mind that Karl Marx had a disdainful attitude towards China. And so I went hunting through, and there's not many references, obviously, in Das Kapital and the other key works to China, but he wrote a series of letters to the New York Tribune in the end of the 1850s, specifically on China, but not about China. I mean, mostly these were coruscating attacks on British imperialism, where China only figured as, the crime that Britain was committing. And it's really kind of amazing that of all the European figures of the modern historical period, Karl Marx is the one that hit home in China, right? I mean, he's had this dramatic impact, and yet his own writing is a testimony to lack of interest. I mean, writing obsessively about Europe, America, everything else, but not about China, very little. I mean, Adam Smith probably wrote more about China than Karl Marx. So that's sort of kind of symptomatic that the European who has had most influence on China is also the one that kind of had the least real engagement with the place in his own writings.
Interestingly enough, Kerry, I was talking to someone at Chetham's music school just earlier this week, and they have this very old library where Marx used to go and read, and now they have lots of Chinese visitors to come to the library to see what he was reading. I just wonder if they go back feeling very disappointed that they didn't find anything. But actually, just talking about that.
Yeah, actually, it's a very in my hometown, and I know that library very well, and have filmed there. And the little alcove in the library where they, there's no electricity then, and they were he and Engels were working there together, because of course Engels was the reason Marx went up to Manchester. Engels' father was a factory owner, and Engels had written the key text prior to that, the condition of the English working class in 1844. So Marx had gone up there to be guided by Engels, and the complete record of the books that they read is there. And of course, it's all housing surveys and cholera surveys and stuff like that for South Lancashire and the state of housing in Manchester and all that kind of business. And Marx talks about the little alcove where they sat and read, so that's what he was there for. I'd be interested to know, did Marx do anything more? He was very, very hot on anti-imperialism on India. And in the mutiny of 1857, so-called mutiny, the First War of Independence, he wrote some absolutely dynamite attacks on British atrocities for the American newspapers that were not allowed to be published in Britain. But he'd got really good information about what the British were doing. Did he do anything like that on the Opium Wars that we don't know about? I just don't know. Or was the information more difficult for him to get hold of? A sidelight on Chinese history, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, one of the byproducts of this with Chetham's is that they've actually now got a link with a music conservatoire in Shanghai, and are trying to work together. And maybe next term in the course of this series, we might try to get something between Chetham's and this conservatoire. We're working on that at the moment. I wonder, Barnaby, have you got many questions coming in? Just remind people, if there are questions, please use your Q&A button.
Right, nothing as yet, but I have some questions of my own in the meantime until they do come.
Right. Okay.
One of my main interests is in literature and the translation of foreign literature into English. And having read a couple of standout books, particularly one by Mo Yen called Frog about the one-child policy, and then the science fiction, The Three-Body Problem, which are great. Why is there not more being translated, or am I just not aware of it?
I would like to add some comment on the translation. Yes, at the moment, there are far more English literature translated into Chinese.
Yes.
But now the Chinese government is actually encouraging Chinese people to translate more Chinese philosophy and literature into Western languages.
Wow.
And in the recent years, I have been helping with some Western scholars and Chinese scholars to edit books on the history of Chinese economic thought. So I'm sure in the next few years, Western people will be able to read more and more translated Chinese literature.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, in the main it's fiction, isn't it? We need a bit more non-fiction probably here. I will temporize until the other questions come in. How realistic is it, perhaps I'd ask Kerry, to expect many people like yourself to take the enormous task of learning to speak and read Chinese, so that we have sufficient cadre of people who can engage and speak as diplomats or journalists or business people with Chinese? And how tough is it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think Chinese as a foreign language is not widely taught in British schools. That's not surprising. And there's all sorts of issues around that. I don't know what the situation is like in America. I mean, Catherine might be able to sort of give a view on that. I mean, it's a difficult thing. I was talking to someone, you know, who deals with encouraging the sort of learning of Chinese at secondary schools in Britain, particularly state schools. And you know, one of the problems is to do an A level, which is the sort of, you know, pre-entry, pre-university entry degree in Britain, exam in Britain, in Chinese is regarded as very, very strange. You know, it's a sort of like not really relate to any particular, you know, kind of career unless you want to do Chinese afterwards. And in Britain, universities that do Chinese, there's not many of them.
That's right.
I think we produce about 300 graduates in Chinese studies a year, and that hasn't changed for a long time.
At all, yeah.
You know, I mean, I think one issue is that there is the idea that if you learn Chinese, you've got to learn it like absolute fluency, classical Chinese, reading Duofu, you know, the lot. And well, I mean, it's okay if you just learn Chinese to sort of have a basic conversation. I mean, you know, when people learn French or German or Italian, you know, often they just learn basics and sort of get by.
Yeah.
And I think it's not enough of that really in Britain. I'm a terrible linguist, but for some very weird reason, I thought Chinese was all right. Got no grammar. I mean, what's not to like? No grammar, no gender, no declensions. I mean, you know, none of the horror of Latin. You know, it was just a delight to learn it. You know, kind of mucking around with der, die, das. You know, I mean, I just loved it. And pictures. You know, I mean, for somebody who couldn't never really properly spell, despite having a degree in English from Cambridge University. I mean, I could never spell. I must be the worst speller that, you know, Cambridge has ever produced in 700 years. No problem in Chinese, just draw a picture. I love it. So I think there are great attractions.
How about that for encouragement? I have a follow-up. I don't know who'd like to take this, which is this. It has been mooted that in many ways the next best thing is to have a course in Chinese civilization so that people are at least acquainted with the history and language and customs and culture of China at a level, but because it conflicts in part with the requirements of university entrance, it wouldn't really be admissible. People would be probably put off doing it. But how feasible is that, do you think? Maybe if I could ask Michael.
The problem, I think, as far as Chinese and
sorry,
and
Michael.
the other Michael. Sorry, go on.
I meant the other Michael. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Barnaby. I was just making a note then on the previous section of the conversation.
Feasibility of having a course at a level not necessarily an exam, to count towards university entrance in Chinese civilization. In other words, focusing on a bit in depth in the history and the culture of China, so that people have some grounding,
Yeah,
which I never did when I first went there.
I would have thought in the 21st century, you absolutely should do that.
Yes.
Without a question. It's massively relevant to our world. It's just fabulously interesting and dynamic and full of kind of drama and humanity, and
Yes.
you know, on every level, it's fantastic to study, and it's what, a fifth of the world or something. So
That's right.
Really, that's exactly what we should do, and that
Right.
would be a major step forward.
Right. How are things in the States, Catherine? I mean, to what extent is it part of the curriculum that people learn a little, even if they're not specialists or learning Chinese, that they have working knowledge of some Chinese history and literature?
I mean, that's such a tough question because our education system is so diversified
right.
across the country, very dependent on local funding.
Yeah.
In this area, this, you know, metropolitan area with a very high level of education, Chinese is available all the way from elementary school through high school. And of course, Georgetown has a fabulous Chinese program, which I know because my daughter majored in Chinese here. So yeah, it's just hard to say. I'm sure that once you get out into rural areas where they have very little foreign language education at all, you're probably not seeing very much of it. I think there's work to be done here in demystifying the Chinese language based on what Carrie said, and also from my experience with my daughter. I'm struggling with Italian right now, and I'm thinking Chinese might be an easier, I guess, for me. But you know, there is this thing that Chinese is so difficult, and anybody who can even learn to say a few words has probably gained about 100 IQ points. And there's this mythology around learning Chinese here that makes people loath to attempt it. So I would like to see a lot more people like Carrie saying, you know, give it a try and see how it goes for you.
Right, thank you. Do you think the panel, perhaps I'd address this to Carrie, given the relative lack of interest in the English-speaking world in Chinese history and literature, does that have much to do with the relatively negative portrait of China in the main media?
It's interesting. Japanese has had a big increase of people wanting to study it because of manga, you know, and popular culture. Korean, because Lord help us, of the Squid Game. Squid Game. Leave the definite article out. Which I'm happy to say has now been brilliantly counterfeited by Chinese, and so the Koreans are extremely irritated by apparently a new version which is not authorized. So I fully endorse that, by the way. I think China's right there. I mean, the Confucius Institutes that were set up over the last 15 years, as you know, I don't know. I don't think Oxford's got one, has it, Michael? Michael Scott. I don't think Oxford's got a Confucius Institute, has it?
No, I don't think so. It's not Confucius. We've got a good Chinese department, but not a Confucius Institute.
So I mean, so I think SOAS has got. We don't. That they were meant to promote the study of Chinese language. Anything is good, but they've been very politicized. I mean, I think in America, I believe Chicago closed its Confucius Institute down. Others have said that they're going to close them down, which is a pity, because I would have thought one of the few areas where there wouldn't be a problem of Chinese funding would be in the teaching of Chinese language. I mean, you know, there's so many. I remember when I learned Chinese, we had to read the letters from a schoolgirl to Zhou Enlai saying how great he was, you know, so I can't remember that having any great ideological impact on me. So I think it would be good to have more of those kind of things, but politically not easy at the moment.
Great, thank you. Ping, what would you say is the main drive for Chinese students to study abroad?
I think there are several main reasons that they would like to study in the West. Number one is, of course, to learn in different culture, which is quite important for them. And the others are like to develop critical thinking, which is something lack of in the Chinese education system, and also problem solving. So while the students study in the West, they develop more skills in these kind of areas, and which will benefit their further study and career development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to what extent is critical thinking actually discouraged in the Chinese school system?
I want to say it's discouraged, but the problem is the way of Chinese learning is all textbook based.
Yeah.
So you learn from the textbooks and the teachers give you the lectures based on the textbooks. And you are not encouraged to challenge the content of the textbooks.
There you go. Yeah. Yes.
Tongping, well, just reading it, did you find it difficult learning English?
Yes, I think I didn't find it difficult in learning English, but to many Chinese students, they may find it difficult in learning it. And again, adding to the learning Chinese in the West, in fact, I know in some schools, students have access to Confucius classroom, where they are lucky enough to be able to learn more about the Chinese history and customs. But it is true that in many UK schools, they don't provide Chinese as a A-level subject, because I send Chinese students to some boarding schools. And in some cases, we have to request Chinese teacher for their A-level subject.
Yes, well, most of the kids who do Chinese at A-level are native Chinese, I think, aren't they, or British-born Chinese. If you
Yeah.
look at the figures, yes. Yeah, this is fascinating. I don't know what can be done, except there are people like me and Kerry and Michael who actually been to China, and it changes you completely and gives you a much wider perspective, and you end up inhabiting a much bigger space, which is wonderful. But most people who are rooted here, the most they'll do is learn French maybe and possibly Spanish because they think it's easier. And we remain a monoculture. And we think because the world speaks English that it's somehow an advantage. It's not, it's a handicap. So yes, it's difficult to travel, it's difficult, and we all by accident have ended up learning more than we expected about China, but it becomes part of you. So how to encourage more exposure to China? I don't know. We do our best, the three of us. I don't know. What would you recommend to get people more interested in China? Because we must.
Can I just add to that, really,
Yeah.
that and Kerry might come in on this, but I think that under the Mrs. Thatcher regime, there was a kind of a migration away from Chinese studies, even because she didn't think it was necessary, but we've got a number of very good universities, and I know here in the UK, and I know that there are very good universities in the States as well who've got Chinese departments, and so there are people there waiting for and encouraging students to come and learn Chinese, and they could do it ab initio, I'm sure, and then move on. So I think there's a kind of a judging by actually just the response of universities in the UK to this program, which I'm very grateful, by the way. There is a movement amongst the universities in the UK to try and reorder it again, get back into Chinese being a language that you should go and learn and can study at university. But of course, Kerry's there at King's. What do you think about this, Kerry?
Yeah, so we only have postgraduates. I mean, as I say, in the UK, the problem is that to study China is an elitist preoccupation. It's for private schools. They do very well. State schools are doing better, but not as easy as for private schools. I mean, I think at the A-level, pre-university level, our A-level is very strange. It's extremely difficult because of historical reasons, because it was meant for actually native speakers who had been from Guangdong or Hong Kong, moving here in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And it's extremely difficult even for native speakers. So can you imagine what it's like to do that degree? Do that exam if you're learning it like as you would learn German or French as a non-native speaker. Unless you get a kind of wider appreciation of the value of learning Chinese at schools, it's not very easy for universities to pick these up. I mean, when you look at those that do study Chinese at British universities, they have very specific reasons for doing so. So 300 is, that's why it's such a small group. And I mean, I certainly wouldn't, I mean, I didn't do Chinese university, I did it as a postgraduate, and I only did it almost by accident, and I'm really glad I did. The course I did now no longer runs. It's going to be a kind of big thing, because the complacency about, you know, kind of particularly in the UK, but maybe in America too, I don't know, is that people will speak English. And I believe 200 million Chinese do speak English up to a point. But, you know, that's not really very helpful when, in a sense, you're requiring a lot of your kind of translation and knowledge to come from those who, yeah, I mean, you know, kind of outside of your particular community. I mean, we rely on Chinese students to sort of often do a lot of this work. And yet then we kind of politically beat them up and say that they're all spies and stuff, you know, like in America, I mean, in Australia, where I used to be based, you know, there was this sort of kind of report in the Sydney Morning Herald about, you know, kind of spy rings being run from the University of Sydney. You know, that must have been one hell of a spy ring with 7,000, you know, kind of students. I mean, I kind of think it's very ludicrous.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's very important to at least have a clear idea that most of the Chinese students here, yeah, I mean, they want to study and they're here for that reason. And why should they, you know, kind of then end up sort of be expected to sometimes work, you know, for British companies and what have you. I mean, they're learning their skills a lot of the time to work for Chinese companies.
Yeah.
We need to have our own abilities.
Yes, exactly. And Mandarin is actually such a pleasant language to speak. I speak it badly. I've delegated my Mandarin to my children who have a Chinese mother. So they're very functional. So they stand in for me. But I'm acutely aware that it's, compared with, for an English speaker to learn French or German, is actually much, to speak it, is actually pronounce it properly, to be understood, is actually easier in Mandarin than in French or German. I speak French and German, so I can attest to that. So it's not a barrier. You have to learn to be any good to learn to read and write. That helps, obviously. But to speak it, it's actually a pleasure. It's a pleasant language. It's musical. You know, you pick it up by listening, which I did over my time. I've been married for 45 years to the same woman, so I am very aware of what things mean, even though I don't understand all the words. So as a vehicle for communication, it is excellent. Huh?
Yeah, if you saw me tapping my head a while ago, it wasn't it wasn't out of horror. It was that my wife had lost her glasses and they were on top of her head. So I was telling her that's the kind of communication that I have with my wife.
Well, that's
She's
right.
killing herself.
Yes.
Goodness, I might be killed in a different way afterwards. One final thing, perhaps, before we do close, and I go to Ping about this. You know, we have lots of these Chinese restaurants and so on over here. What about the food culture? Is this a prominent thing in China, or does it change from areas in China of a food culture?
Yes, I think so. Food culture has been the center of Chinese culture for centuries, and Chinese believe food is very important to their daily life, and they believe it is important to eating good food because it can bring harmony and closeness to the family and the relationship. And in fact, a lot of business negotiation it was done during the meal time.
Oh, yeah.
So for many years, particularly at my childhood, the way we greet each other is "Have you eaten?" instead of "Good morning" or "Good evening." And even nowadays, a lot of people still do that. And of course, there are a lot of different cuisines in China and different regions. And of course, the mostly famous and important cuisines there are 8 of them. I'm not going to list them, but the most well-known in the West is Cantonese and Sichuanese. Sichuanese is from Chengdu, where I come from. and it's very spicy, but it
Right.
has become more and more popular in the West as well.
Absolutely. Sichuan Tsai. Oh,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
and well, I've experienced that a few times now in Chengdu, and I have to say it is absolutely beautiful, the food. So, and thank you for that being when I've been out there. Well, what an afternoon. Can I thank you, Michael Wood, Kerry Brown, Catherine Temple, and Tong Ping. Such an interesting debate, and wide-ranging, moving around, and so easily. I've thoroughly enjoyed it here, just listening to you. And of course, Barnaby from SACU. Thank you very much, Barnaby, for taking the question or giving the questions and engaging in the conversation.
Not a bit,
I
Michael.
need to
Can I have
thank
one other question? Sorry to interrupt.
Okay,
I
very
think
quick. Must be quick.
Tong Ping would like to feel this. Does she think, this is Tong Ping, that Western academics have a truly accurate perception of Chinese society and culture?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. And also it depends on, who is this Western academics. So I have, over the years I live in the West, I have met a lot of Western academics. And personally, I have brought a lot of Western academics and vice chancellors to China to visit as well. In general, their opinion to China is quite positive. But there are some Western academics who are quite critical to China.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can I thank my colleagues at Georgetown University, particularly the President, Jack DeGioia, and the Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff, who really made this happen. At Blackfriars Hall, thanks to John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute. At Campion Hall to Dr. Nick Austin, the Master of the Hall, Sarah Gray, Ying, Campion Hall administrators, and Joseph Simmons, SJ, who's a research fellow. And at SACU, thanks very much, of course, to Barnaby again, but also to Zoe Reed and to the executive. My thanks to Toya Woolen, Amy van der Villette, Mary Gordon, Leanne Dockett, and colleagues at Georgetown who've made the Zoom possible and kept us on air for the last hour and a quarter or so. Thank everybody who's been asking questions. If there are any questions in that we haven't answered because of time, we'll see if we can answer them by email. The next event in this series will be on Friday, November the 5th. And could you please note, especially if you're in the UK, that although it's going to be at 11 a.m. EST time, it will be at 3 p.m. GMT in the UK, not 4 p.m. That's because we'll have put our clocks back, but America hasn't put its clocks back, or won't be doing it until the following week. So it's a shorter time span. So it's 3 p.m. on for the British contingent on November the 5th. It remains 11 a.m. For the American contingent. Later on, we go back after a week. We go back to the 4 p.m. This event on November the 5th will be a talk by Professor Terry Peach of Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, followed by a discussion. And the subject is Plato and Xunzi, the construction of the ideal state, a meeting of distant minds. This will be new territory, I know, for many of us. So I'm looking forward to it, to see two philosophers being compared. I'd like to tell you about two other events coming up. On Tuesday, the 26th of October, we continue our second year in this series on the Christian literary imagination with John Hirsch, who's a professor at Georgetown, who's going to be discussing Chaucer. On the 15th of November at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. BST, our next free speech project at a Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future of Humanities Project, we'll be discussing issues relating to political hypocrisy, the truth and the rise of popular lies. Seems somewhat contemporary and links in with some of the things we said earlier today. can I thank you all for attending today, this first event in the China series. Can I again thank my colleagues for such an engaging discussion. I'm Professor Mike Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. And so until the next time, take care and keep safe. Thank you again, everybody. Goodbye.